Thomas Mitchell had been standing guard at Kensington Palace for 15 years. His polished black boots had walked the same marble corridors thousands of times, and his red uniform had witnessed countless royal moments. At 42 years old, he was one of the most respected guards in the entire royal security team. Everyone knew Thomas as the man who never smiled while on duty, never broke protocol, and never showed any emotion on his weathered face. The morning of September 15th started like any other day. Thomas arrived at the palace at 5 in the morning, just as he had done every day for the past decade and a half. He put on his ceremonial uniform with the same careful precision he always used. Each button was fastened exactly right, each crease was perfectly straight, and his tall black hat sat at the exact angle required by royal protocol. But something felt different that morning. Thomas couldn't put his finger on what it was, but there was a strange feeling in the air. Perhaps it was the way the autumn leaves were beginning to fall outside the palace windows. Or maybe it was the unusual quietness in the corridors. Whatever it was, Thomas pushed the feeling aside and focused on his duties. Prince George, now 12 years old, had grown up seeing Thomas every single day. The young prince had learned to walk in these very hallways, with Thomas watching over him from a respectful distance. Over the years, George had tried many times to get Thomas to smile or talk to him, but the guard always maintained his professional silence. It had become almost a game between them, though Thomas never acknowledged it. On this particular morning, Prince George was walking to his private tutoring session when he noticed something unusual. Thomas was standing in his usual spot by the grand staircase, but there was something different about his posture. The guard's shoulders seemed to sag slightly, and his usual perfect stance appeared less rigid than normal. George had always been an observant child. His mother, the Princess of Wales, often said he had an unusual ability to notice things that others missed. As he walked past Thomas, George slowed his steps and looked more carefully at the man who had been a constant presence in his life. What George saw made him stop walking entirely. There, rolling slowly down Thomas's cheek, was a single tear. The guard was crying, though he was trying hard to hide it. His face remained as stone-like as always, but that one tear betrayed the pain he was feeling inside. For a moment, George stood frozen in the hallway. He had never seen any of the guards show emotion before. They were like living statues, always professional, always in control. But here was Thomas, the most serious guard of them all, crying while still trying to maintain his duty. George's first instinct was to continue walking and pretend he hadn't seen anything. After all, that's what royal protocol would suggest. But something deep inside the young prince wouldn't let him ignore what he had witnessed. This man had protected him and his family for years, standing for hours without complaint, watching over them in silence. The young prince made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking past and pretending nothing had happened, George approached Thomas directly. He stood right in front of the guard, looking up at his tall, imposing figure. Thomas felt the presence of the young prince, but continued to stare straight ahead as his training demanded. However, his heart began to race. Had the prince noticed his moment of weakness? Would this mean the end of his career? Guards were not supposed to show emotion, especially not in front of members of the royal family. George stood there for several long seconds, just looking at Thomas. The hallway was completely silent, except for the soft ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Then, without saying a word, George did something that no one could have predicted. The 12-year-old prince reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. It was embroidered with his initials, a gift from his grandmother. George had been carrying it that morning because his tutor had reminded him that a proper gentleman always carries a handkerchief. Still without speaking, George gently reached up and dabbed the tear from Thomas's cheek. The guard's eyes widened in shock, but he didn't move. He couldn't move. The simple, kind gesture from the young prince had caught him completely off guard. After wiping away the tear, George folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it in Thomas's white-gloved hand. Then he looked up into the guard's eyes and spoke in a soft voice that only Thomas could hear. "Everyone needs to cry sometimes," George whispered. "Even the strongest people." Thomas felt his chest tighten with emotion. In all his years of service, no one from the royal family had ever acknowledged his humanity in such a direct way. He was used to being invisible, a piece of furniture that happened to breathe and wear a uniform. George continued in his gentle voice. "I don't know what's making you sad, but I want you to know that I see you, not just as a guard, but as a person. You've always made me feel safe, and I hope someday I can make you feel better too." The young prince then did something even more surprising. He stepped forward and gave Thomas a quick, gentle hug around his waist. It lasted only a few seconds, but in those moments, years of professional distance melted away. Thomas stood there, overwhelmed by the kindness and maturity of the young prince. He had been crying because he had received some devastating personal news that morning. His younger brother, who lived in Scotland, had been diagnosed with a serious illness. Thomas had been trying to process this information while maintaining his duties, but the emotion had been too much to contain. George stepped back and smiled at Thomas. It wasn't the formal smile that royal children are trained to give in public. It was genuine, warm, and full of compassion. "I have to go to my lessons now," George said quietly, "but I hope your day gets better." As the prince walked away, Thomas remained standing in his position, but everything had changed. The handkerchief in his hand felt like the most precious thing he had ever been given. Not because it belonged to a prince, but because it represented a moment of pure human connection. For the rest of that day, Thomas found himself thinking about the encounter. He had spent 15 years maintaining perfect professional distance from the royal family. He had been trained to be invisible, to serve without being seen as a person. But in a few short minutes, a 12-year-old boy had changed everything. That evening, when Thomas returned to his small apartment outside London, he sat at his kitchen table and really thought about his life for the first time in years. He had joined the Royal Guard because he believed in service and duty. He had given up having a normal social life, relationships, and many personal freedoms to serve the crown. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that he was still a human being underneath the uniform. He had become so focused on being the perfect guard that he had lost touch with his own emotions and needs. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the palace with the same punctuality as always, but he felt different inside. When he saw Prince George walking to breakfast, the young prince gave him a small nod and a gentle smile. Thomas found himself wanting to smile back, though he managed to maintain his professional composure. Over the following days, Thomas began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. He saw how Prince George always said "please" and "thank you" to the palace staff, even though he didn't have to. He watched how the young prince would sometimes stop to ask the cleaning ladies about their families, or how he would always greet the kitchen staff by name. Thomas realized that Prince George's kindness toward him hadn't been unusual or out of character. The young prince was simply a genuinely caring person who treated everyone around him with respect and compassion, regardless of their position or rank. This observation made Thomas's internal struggle even more intense. Here was a child who would one day be king, yet he showed more genuine humanity than many adults Thomas had known. It made the guard question whether his rigid adherence to protocol was really serving anyone, including himself. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself having conversations with other guards and palace staff that he had never had before. He learned that many of them struggled with the same feelings of invisibility and emotional isolation that he had been experiencing. They all loved their jobs and felt honored to serve the royal family, but they also sometimes felt like they had lost parts of themselves in the process. 3 weeks after the handkerchief incident, Thomas received another piece of difficult news. His elderly mother, who lived alone in a small village in Wales, had fallen and broken her hip. She was in the hospital and needed someone to care for her during her recovery. Thomas was her only child, and there was no one else who could help. This news put Thomas in an impossible situation. His mother needed him desperately, but requesting extended leave during his prime working years could damage his career. The Royal Guard Service valued dedication above all else, and guards were expected to prioritize their duties over personal matters. Thomas spent several sleepless nights trying to figure out what to do. He had saved enough money over the years to support himself if he lost his job, but the Royal Guard wasn't just his career. It was his identity. He had built his entire adult life around serving the crown. During this time of internal struggle, Prince George seemed to sense that something was wrong. The observant young prince noticed that Thomas seemed more distracted than usual. When George walked past him in the corridors, he could see that the guard's eyes looked tired and worried. One afternoon, when the palace was particularly quiet, Prince George approached Thomas again. This time, instead of offering comfort, he decided to try a different approach. "Mr. Mitchell," George said softly, using Thomas's surname for the first time. "May I ask you something?" Thomas was surprised to hear the prince address him by name. Most royal family members never bothered to learn the names of individual guards. He nodded slightly, indicating that the prince could speak. "Do you have a family?" George asked in his innocent way. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I have a mother." "Do you miss her?" George continued, his young face showing genuine concern. Thomas paused for a long moment before answering. "Yes, Your Royal Highness, I do." George nodded thoughtfully. "My father once told me that loving your family is the most important job anyone can have, even more important than being a prince." These simple words hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. Here was a future king telling him that family came first, even before royal duty. The wisdom coming from such a young person amazed Thomas and made him realize that perhaps his priorities had been wrong all along. That evening, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. He decided to speak with his supervisor about his situation. Commander Harrison was a stern man who had been in charge of palace security for over 20 years. Thomas had always been slightly afraid of him, but he knew he had to be honest about his circumstances. The next morning, Thomas requested a private meeting with Commander Harrison. As he sat in the small office overlooking the palace gardens, Thomas explained his mother's situation and his need to care for her. He prepared himself for disappointment, expecting to be told that duty came first. To his surprise, Commander Harrison listened carefully and then said something unexpected. "Mitchell, you've been one of our most dedicated guards for 15 years. You've never asked for anything, never complained, never caused any problems. If you need time to care for your family, we'll find a way to make it work." Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been so focused on being the perfect guard that he had forgotten his supervisors were human beings too. Commander Harrison arranged for Thomas to take a 3-month leave of absence to care for his mother, with the possibility of extension if needed. When Prince George learned that Thomas would be leaving temporarily, he asked his private secretary if he could speak with the guard before his departure. This was an unusual request, as royal family members typically didn't have personal conversations with individual staff members, but an exception was made for the young prince. The meeting took place in one of the smaller palace sitting rooms. Thomas stood at attention as Prince George entered, but the prince immediately asked him to sit down in one of the comfortable chairs. "I heard you're going to take care of your mother," George said, settling into the chair across from Thomas. "I think that's wonderful." Thomas was still adjusting to being treated as a person rather than a piece of furniture. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. It means a great deal to me." George leaned forward in his chair. "Can I tell you something, Mr. Mitchell? Something my grandmother taught me?" Thomas nodded, curious about what wisdom the Queen had shared with her great-grandson. "She told me that the best way to serve others is to first take care of the people we love most. She said that when we love our families well, it makes us better at loving everyone else too." The young prince paused and then continued. "I've watched you protect my family for years. You've always been so strong and reliable. But I never realized until that day when you were crying that you might need protecting too." Thomas felt his eyes begin to water again, but this time he didn't try to hide his emotions. "Your Royal Highness, your kindness has meant more to me than you could possibly know." George smiled. "My mother says that kindness is like a boomerang. When you throw it out into the world, it comes back to you. You've been kind to my family for 15 years by keeping us safe. Now it's time for kindness to come back to you." The prince then stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room. He wrote something on a piece of palace stationery and handed it to Thomas. It was a simple note that read, "Dear Mrs. Mitchell, your son Thomas is one of the bravest and most caring people I know. I hope you feel better soon. With respect, Prince George." "Would you give this to your mother?" George asked. "I thought she might like to know how much we appreciate her son." Thomas accepted the note with hands that trembled slightly. "She will treasure this forever, Your Royal Highness." As Thomas prepared to leave for Wales, he found himself reflecting on how much his perspective had changed in just a few weeks. The encounter with Prince George had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for years, his ability to connect with others as a human being. During his time caring for his mother, Thomas discovered parts of himself that he had forgotten existed. He remembered how to laugh, how to have long conversations about life, and how to show affection openly. His mother, despite her injury, was delighted to have her son home for an extended period. "You seem different, Thomas," his mother said one evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from her cottage window. "You seem more like yourself, if that makes sense." Thomas knew exactly what she meant. For the first time in years, he felt like a complete person rather than just a man in a uniform. As his mother's health improved, Thomas began to think about his future. He loved his job and respected the royal family deeply, but he had also realized that he wanted more balance in his life. He wanted to maintain his connections with other people, to have relationships, and to be present for his family when they needed him. When the 3-month leave was nearly over, Thomas received an unexpected phone call from Commander Harrison. "Mitchell," the commander said, "we've been thinking about your situation here at the palace. How would you feel about taking on a new role, one that might give you more flexibility?" Thomas was intrigued. Commander Harrison explained that the palace was looking for someone to head up a new community outreach program. The position would involve working with local schools and organizations to teach children about royal history and citizenship. It would still be a palace job, but with more normal hours and the ability to travel home regularly. The job had been created partly because Prince George had suggested to his parents that the palace should do more to connect with regular people in the community. The young prince had specifically mentioned that someone like Thomas, who understood both royal protocol and genuine human kindness, would be perfect for such a role. Thomas was amazed to learn that Prince George had been thinking about him and had even played a part in creating this new opportunity. It seemed that the 12-year-old's wisdom extended far beyond his years. After discussing the opportunity with his mother, Thomas decided to accept the new position. It would allow him to continue serving the royal family while also maintaining the human connections that had become so important to him. When Thomas returned to the palace to begin his new role, Prince George was one of the first people he encountered. The young prince greeted him with a genuine smile and asked about his mother's recovery. "She's doing much better, thank you for asking, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied. "And thank you for the note you wrote to her. She has it framed on her mantelpiece." George grinned. "I'm glad she liked it, and I'm excited about your new job. I heard you're going to teach children about what it's like to work at the palace." Thomas nodded. "I hope I can help them understand that serving others is one of the most rewarding things a person can do." "I think you'll be amazing at it," George said confidently. "You know all about dedication and service, but now you also remember how to be yourself too." As Thomas settled into his new role, he often reflected on how one small act of kindness from a young prince had changed the entire direction of his life. He had gone from being a man who hid his emotions behind a uniform to someone who could balance professional duty with personal authenticity. 6 months after Thomas began his new role as head of community outreach, something remarkable had happened. The program he led had become one of the most successful initiatives the palace had ever undertaken. Children from schools all across London were visiting the palace to learn about royal history, civic duty, and the importance of service to others. What made Thomas's program special wasn't just the information he shared, but the way he connected with each child who visited. He remembered what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than just a uniform, and he made sure every child felt heard and valued during their visit. During one particular school visit, a shy 8-year-old girl named Emma approached Thomas after his presentation. She had been very quiet throughout the day, barely participating in the group activities. "Mr. Mitchell," she said in a small voice, "do you think someone like me could ever work at a palace?" Thomas knelt down to her eye level. "What do you mean by someone like you, Emma?" The little girl looked down at her shoes. "Well, I'm not very brave, and I'm not good at talking to people. I think you have to be really special to work somewhere like this." Thomas smiled gently. "Emma, do you want to know a secret? I used to be very shy, too. When I first started working here, I was so nervous that my hands would shake every morning." Emma looked up at him with wide eyes. "Really?" "Really," Thomas confirmed. "But you know what I learned? Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you do good things even when you are scared. And being special doesn't mean you're perfect. It means you care about other people." Thomas spent a few more minutes talking with Emma about her dreams and interests. By the end of their conversation, she was smiling and talking more confidently. As her class prepared to leave, Emma ran back to Thomas and hugged him. "Thank you for making me feel special," she said. Thomas watched her leave with her classmates, and he realized that this was exactly why Prince George's kindness had been so powerful. When someone makes you feel seen and valued, it changes something deep inside you. It had happened to him, and now he was able to pass that gift on to others. Later that same day, Thomas received an unexpected visitor in his office. Prince George, now 13 and even more thoughtful than before, had asked to speak with him. "I heard about your conversation with Emma today," George said as he sat down across from Thomas's desk. "My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was with the group. She said you made that little girl feel like she could accomplish anything." Thomas was pleased that the prince had heard about the interaction, but he was curious about why George had come to see him. "She's a lovely child, Your Royal Highness. She just needed someone to believe in her." George nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what you did for me, you know." Thomas looked puzzled. "I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness, but I'm not sure what you mean. You've always been confident and kind. You certainly didn't need me to believe in you." The young prince smiled. "Not in the way you might think, but watching you change from someone who hid his feelings to someone who could be both professional and caring, that showed me something really important." George leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. You see, Mr. Mitchell, everyone always tells me about the responsibilities I'll have as king someday. They talk about duty and protocol and maintaining traditions. But you showed me that real leadership isn't about being perfect or hiding your humanity. It's about connecting with people and caring about them as individuals. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same emotion he had experienced that day when George had wiped away his tear. The prince continued, "When I saw you crying that day, I realized that even the strongest, most dedicated people have moments when they need help. And when you accepted help and made changes in your life, you became even better at your job. That taught me that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." George paused and then said something that completely surprised Thomas. "I wanted to thank you for teaching me how to be a better future king, even though you probably didn't realize that's what you were doing." Thomas was speechless for a moment. He had always thought of their interactions as Prince George helping him, not the other way around. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas finally said, "I think you had the wisdom inside you all along. You saw someone in pain and chose to help, even though it wasn't expected of you. That level of compassion can't be taught." George smiled. "Maybe we helped each other then." As their conversation continued, Thomas learned that Prince George had been following the success of the community outreach program with great interest. The young prince had even asked his parents if he could occasionally participate in the school visits, though he understood the security complications that would involve. "I'd love to meet some of the children you work with," George explained. "I think it would be good for me to talk with young people who aren't part of the royal world. It might help me understand better how to serve them when I'm older." Thomas was struck by the maturity and thoughtfulness of the 13-year-old prince. Most teenagers were focused on their own interests and social lives, but George was already thinking about how to be a better future leader. Over the following months, arrangements were made for Prince George to occasionally join Thomas for special school visits. These interactions had to be carefully planned for security reasons, but they proved to be incredibly valuable for everyone involved. The children who met Prince George during these visits were amazed to discover that he was genuinely interested in their lives and opinions. He asked them about their dreams, their schools, their families, and their communities. He listened carefully to their answers and remembered details from previous conversations. One particularly memorable visit involved a group of children from a school in a disadvantaged area of London. Many of these kids had never imagined they would visit a palace, let alone meet a future king. Thomas watched as Prince George effortlessly connected with each child, making them feel important and valued. During that visit, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus asked Prince George a direct question. "Do you ever get scared about being king someday?" Without hesitation, George answered honestly, "Yes, sometimes I do. It's a big responsibility, and I want to do a good job. But I've learned from some very wise people that being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave." George glanced at Thomas as he spoke, acknowledging the lesson he had learned from watching the guard overcome his own fears and challenges. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My dad says that too. He says being brave means doing the right thing even when it's hard." "Your dad sounds very smart," George replied. "What does he do for work?" "He's a bus driver," Marcus said proudly. "He takes people to work and school and the hospital. He says it's important because everyone needs to get where they're going safely." George's face lit up. "That is important. Your father serves his community just like Mr. Mitchell and I try to serve ours. There are so many different ways to help people." Thomas watched this exchange with deep admiration. Prince George understood that service came in many forms, and that every person's contribution mattered, regardless of their job or social position. As the community outreach program continued to grow and succeed, Thomas found himself becoming something he had never expected, a bridge between the royal family and the regular people they served. His unique background as both a former guard and someone who had learned to balance duty with humanity made him perfectly suited for this role. The program began to expand beyond school visits. Thomas started organizing community events where local residents could learn about civic engagement and volunteer opportunities. He worked with charities to create programs that connected young people with meaningful ways to serve their communities. Throughout all of this work, Thomas maintained his friendship with Prince George. Their relationship had evolved from guard and prince to mentor and student, though they both recognized that they continued to learn from each other. On the second anniversary of the day when Prince George had wiped away his tear, Thomas received an unexpected gift. It was a framed photograph of himself teaching a group of children during one of the palace visits, with a handwritten note from the prince. The note read, "Dear Mr. Mitchell, thank you for showing me that the best way to serve others is to first remember our own humanity. Your kindness continues to inspire everyone around you. With gratitude and respect, George." Thomas hung the photograph in his office, where it served as a daily reminder of how one moment of compassion could change everything. He had stepped down from his position as a royal guard, but he had stepped up into something even more meaningful, a life where duty and humanity worked together in perfect harmony. The story of Thomas and Prince George's friendship became quietly legendary within palace circles. It represented everything the royal family hoped to embody: the importance of seeing each person as an individual, the value of genuine human connection, and the understanding that true leadership comes from the heart as much as from training. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the moment that changed his life, he would always smile and say, "Sometimes the most powerful choices are the silent ones. A young prince chose to see me as a person rather than just a guard, and that choice changed both of our lives forever." Thomas never forgot the white handkerchief with the embroidered initials, which he kept as a treasured reminder of the day he learned that even future kings understand the importance of simple human kindness. And Prince George, as he continued to grow and prepare for his future role, carried with him the lesson that true strength comes from the courage to care about others, especially those who might otherwise remain invisible. The royal guard had stepped down from his post, but in doing so, both he and the young prince had stepped up into a deeper understanding of what it truly means to serve with both honor and heart.